I was working at a I was working at a tourist information desk in Prague when an American couple walked up to me with a map. They looked stressed. The woman pointed at the map and said, "Excuse me, can you help us find our hotel? We booked something near the Eiffel Tower, but we've been walking for 2 hours and can't find it." I stared at her, then at the map, then back at her. "Ma'am," I said carefully, "the Eiffel Tower is in Paris. You're in Prague." "That's in the Czech Republic." She looked at her husband. He looked at the map. They both looked at me like I was the confused one. "But isn't Prague a neighborhood in Paris?" she asked. I didn't know whether to laugh or cry. Another time, I was bartending in Vienna when a tourist asked me for directions to see the Spanish Steps. I told him, "Those are in Rome." He got annoyed. "No, they're here. I Googled famous stairs in Austria." I pulled out my phone and showed him. Rome, Italy, not Austria. He stared at the screen for a solid 10 seconds before saying, "Well, that's misleading." I still don't know what was misleading about it. My friend works at a hotel in Amsterdam. A guest once asked her what time the Northern Lights show starts. She said, "Sir, you'd need to go to Norway or Iceland for that. We don't have them here." He crossed his arms. "But Amsterdam is in Scandinavia." She said, "No, it's in the Netherlands." He insisted she was wrong. He even showed her a travel blog that listed Amsterdam under Scandinavian cities to visit. She gave up and told him the Northern Lights show starts at midnight. He left happy. She still feels guilty. I worked as a tour guide in Brussels for a summer. An American man asked me where the Mona Lisa was displayed. I said, "That's in Paris, at the Louvre." He nodded slowly, then said, "Right, but which museum here has the second Mona Lisa?" I told him there's only one. He didn't believe me. He said his cousin saw it in Brussels last year. I asked if maybe his cousin was confused. He said, "No, she's very smart. She went to college." I didn't know how to respond to that. Turns out his cousin had seen a postcard. These stories aren't rare. They happen every single day. Americans abroad often mix up capitals, cities, and entire countries. And I'm not saying it to be mean. It's just a pattern. A very funny, very confusing pattern. Sometimes it's harmless. Other times it derails entire vacations. But it always makes for great stories. So let's talk about the moments when Americans got world geography completely, hilariously wrong. I used to work at a train station in Zurich. A woman came up to the ticket counter and asked for a train to Berlin. I told her we had several options and showed her the schedule. She looked at the times and said, "Wait, it takes 4 hours to get to Berlin from here?" I said yes, roughly. She shook her head. "That can't be right. Berlin is the capital of Switzerland." I blinked. "Berlin is the capital of Germany," I said. She pulled out her phone and started typing. I watched her face change as Google corrected her. She bought the ticket without saying another word. Another guy asked me for directions to the Austrian Parliament building. I told him he was in Switzerland, not Austria. He said, "Aren't they the same thing?" I said no. He said, "But you both have mountains and speak German." I explained that didn't make them the same country. He looked genuinely shocked. He'd been telling people back home he was visiting Austria. He'd been in Switzerland the whole time. 3 days, wrong country. My cousin works at a museum in Copenhagen. An American tourist asked her where the Swedish royal palace was. She said, "That's in Stockholm." "This is Denmark." The tourist frowned. "But isn't Copenhagen in Sweden?" My cousin said no. The woman argued for a minute before finally looking it up. Then she got embarrassed and left. My cousin said it happens at least twice a week. People assume Copenhagen, Stockholm, and Oslo are all interchangeable. They're not. They're 3 different capitals in 3 different countries. I met a traveler in Budapest who thought he was in Bucharest. He kept talking about how excited he was to see Romania. I told him Budapest is in Hungary. He said, "Wait, those are different cities?" I said yes. He said, "But they sound the same." I said they sound similar, but they're in completely different countries. He checked his booking confirmation. Sure enough, Budapest. Hungary. He'd been telling his family he was in Romania for 2 days. He had to call them and explain. They didn't believe him at first. A friend who works in Dublin told me a story about a guest who wanted to visit Stonehenge. She told him that's in England, not Ireland. He said, "But isn't Dublin part of the UK?" She said, "No, Ireland is its own country." He looked confused. "Then why do you speak English?" She explained that Ireland was colonized by England for centuries. He said, "Oh, so it's like a state." She said no. He didn't fully understand, but he thanked her and left. I was at a coffee shop in Lisbon when I overheard 2 Americans talking. One said, "I can't believe we're finally in Spain." The other said, "I know, Lisbon is beautiful." I leaned over. "Sorry, but Lisbon is in Portugal." They looked at me. "No, it's in Spain," one said. I pulled up a map, showed them Portugal, not Spain. They stared at it. One said, "Well, they're basically the same." The other nodded. I stopped trying. Another time in Athens, a tourist asked me where the Colosseum was. I said, "That's in Rome." She said, "No, the one here in Greece." I said, "There isn't one in Greece." She insisted. She said she saw pictures online labeled Athens Colosseum. I searched for it. Turns out she'd seen the Odeon of Herodes Atticus, which is an ancient theater. Not a Colosseum, not even close to the same thing. She still called it the Colosseum. I worked at a bookstore in Oslo. A man asked me if we had maps of Finland. I said sure and handed him one. He looked at it and said, "Wait, where's Oslo on here?" I said, "Oslo is in Norway." He said, "But isn't this Norway?" I said, "Yes." He said, "Then why doesn't the Finland map show it?" I explained that Finland and Norway are different countries. He looked at me like I was making it up. He bought the map anyway. A family came into a cafe in Brussels where I worked. They wanted to know what time the windmills opened. I said, "Windmills are mostly in the Netherlands, not Belgium." The dad said, "But Brussels is Dutch, right?" I said, "No, Brussels is in Belgium." He said, "Same thing." I said, "It's not." He didn't care. He wanted windmill directions. I told him to take a train to Amsterdam. He left annoyed, like I was being difficult. I was guiding a walking tour in Edinburgh when someone asked how far we were from London. I said about 400 miles, roughly 6 hours by train. She looked surprised. I thought Scotland was near London. I said Scotland is its own country within the UK, and Edinburgh is the capital. She said, "Wait, so England and Scotland aren't the same?" I said no. She'd been calling everything England the whole trip. I gently corrected her. She seemed embarrassed, but grateful. Another traveler I met in Krakow thought Poland was part of Russia. I told him Poland is its own country. He said, "But don't they speak Russian there?" I said, "No, they speak Polish." He said, "Isn't that the same?" I said, "No." He asked if they use the same alphabet. I said Polish uses the Latin alphabet. Russian uses Cyrillic. He looked overwhelmed. He said, "Geography is confusing." I agreed. My friend works at a hostel in Reykjavik. A guest asked her what language they speak in Iceland. She said Icelandic. He said, "So like Norwegian?" She said, "No, it's a different language." He said, "But you're all Nordic." She explained that didn't mean they all spoke the same language. He asked if she spoke Norwegian then. She said a little, but not fluently. He said, "See? Same thing." She gave up. I was in a taxi in Prague when the driver told me about an American passenger who asked if they were close to Germany. The driver said they were about an hour from the border. The passenger said, "Oh, good. I want to visit Berlin today." The driver explained Berlin is hours away, not just across the border. The passenger got upset. He thought Germany was small, like the size of a state. The driver had to show him a map. The guy was shocked. A woman at a train station in Milan asked me how to get to Venice. I told her the train takes a few hours. She said, "Isn't Venice just a part of Milan?" I said, "No, it's a separate city on the other side of the region." She said, "But Italy's tiny, right?" I said, "Italy is roughly the size of Arizona." She didn't believe me. She looked it up. She was stunned. She'd thought the whole country was the size of a city. Another tourist in Stockholm asked me where the Swiss Alps were. I said Switzerland, not Sweden. She said, "Aren't they close?" I said no. Sweden is in Northern Europe. Switzerland is in Central Europe. She said, "But both start with S." I didn't have a response for that. She left confused. I met someone in Barcelona who thought Spain and Mexico were next to each other. I said there's an entire ocean between them. He said, "But they both speak Spanish." I said yes, because Spain colonized Mexico. He said, "So they're connected?" I said no, only historically. He still didn't fully get it. A guy in Vienna asked me if Austria was part of Germany. I said no. He said, "But Hitler was Austrian and led Germany." I said yes, but that doesn't make Austria part of Germany. He said, "Seems like it should." I explained they're separate countries with separate governments. He nodded but still seemed unsure. I worked at a ticket booth in Brussels. A man wanted to visit the Anne Frank house. I told him that's in Amsterdam. He said, "How far is that?" I said about 2 hours by train. He said, "Why is it so far?" I said, "Because Amsterdam is in the Netherlands and we're in Belgium." He said, "I thought Brussels was in Holland." I said, "No." He asked what the difference was. I explained for 5 minutes. He bought a train ticket but still looked lost. Another time in Lisbon, someone asked me where they could see flamenco dancing. I said, "That's more of a Spanish thing. You'd want to go to Seville or Madrid." She said, "But isn't Portugal in Spain?" I said no. She said, "Then what's the difference?" I said they're two separate countries with different cultures and languages. She said, "But you're all Hispanic, right?" I said no. Portuguese people aren't Hispanic. She apologized but still seemed confused. I gave her directions to a Fado show instead. She loved it. I was working at a car rental office in Munich when an American asked for a car with a full tank of gas. I said sure. He asked how many gallons the tank held. I said we use liters here. He asked me to convert it. I said roughly 15 gallons. He said, "That's tiny." I explained European cars are smaller and more efficient. He said, "But how will I drive across Europe in that?" I asked where he was going. He said Paris, Amsterdam, and Rome. I told him that's thousands of kilometers. He said, "How many miles is that?" I did the math. He was shocked. He thought Europe was the size of Texas. Another customer asked me why the speed limit signs were so high. I said, "That's kilometers per hour, not miles." He said, "So I can't go 100? I said, "You can, but that's only about 60 miles per hour. He looked relieved. Then he asked why we made it so confusing. I said, "It's not confusing, it's just metric." He shook his head and muttered something about freedom units. My friend works at a pharmacy in Paris. An American asked for Tylenol. She offered him paracetamol. He said, "No, I need Tylenol." She explained it's the same thing, just a different name. He didn't believe her. He wanted the American brand. She showed him the active ingredient label. Same thing. He bought it, but complained the whole time that it wasn't real Tylenol. I was at a grocery store in Oslo when I saw a tourist staring at milk cartons. He looked confused. I asked if he needed help. He said, "Why is the milk in bags?" I said it's in cartons. He pointed at the liter label. "That says 1. "That's not enough." I said 1 liter is about a quart. He said, "Why not just use quarts?" I said most of the world uses liters. He said, "That's weird." He bought 2 cartons, still unsure. A woman in Rome asked me why the temperature was so high. It was 25 degrees. I said, "That's Celsius. It's about 77 Fahrenheit. She said, "Why do you use Celsius?" I said most countries do. She said, "But Fahrenheit is more accurate." I said it's just a different scale. She insisted Fahrenheit was better. I didn't argue. She left sweating in her jacket because she didn't believe me. I worked at a hotel in Amsterdam. A guest complained that his room was too small. I checked the booking. It was 20 square meters. He said, "That's tiny." I said, "It's about 200 square feet." He said, "Why didn't you say that?" I said we list it in meters because that's standard here. He said, You should use feet for American guests. I said we get guests from everywhere. He left annoyed. Another traveler in Zurich asked me why everything was so expensive. I said Switzerland has a high cost of living. He said, but this sandwich is 15 francs. That's like $15. I said no, it's closer to $16 because of the exchange rate. He said, that's ridiculous. I said welcome to Switzerland. He asked if there was a McDonald's nearby. I pointed him to one. He came back later and said even McDonald's was expensive. I nodded. A man in Copenhagen asked me why the weather app said 12 degrees, but it felt cold. I said, that's Celsius. He said, so what is it really? I said about 54 Fahrenheit. He said, why didn't it just say that? I said it did. He just had to change the settings. He looked at his phone, changed it, then complained that his phone should do that automatically. I was at a train station in Brussels when someone asked how fast the train goes. I said up to 300 kilometers per hour. He said, that's slow. I said, that's about 185 miles per hour. His eyes went wide. Oh, that's fast. I nodded. He asked why we didn't just say miles. I said, because we use kilometers. He said it was confusing. I agreed to disagree. Another tourist in Vienna asked me why the distances on signs were so big. I said, that's kilometers. He said, so how far is Salzburg? I said about 300 kilometers. He said, in miles? I said about 185. He said, why not just put that? I said, because Austria uses the metric system like most of the world. He said, America should make everywhere use miles. I smiled and said good luck with that. I was back at that information desk in Prague a few months later. A different American couple approached. The man said, can you help us? We're trying to find Big Ben. I took a deep breath. That's in London, I said. He looked at his wife. She looked at the map. He looked back at me. But we're in Europe. I said, yes, and London is in England, which is a different country from the Czech Republic. He paused. Then he said, but we flew into Europe. Aren't all the landmarks here? I didn't even know where to start. I just handed him a map of the UK and told him to take a cheap flight. He thanked me and left. I watched him go, wondering how he'd made it this far. My favorite story came from a friend in Athens. A tourist asked her where the Parthenon was. She pointed up at the Acropolis. He could literally see it. He said, no, the real one. She said, that is the real one. He said, I thought it was in a museum. She explained it's an ancient ruin on a hill. Right there, the actual historical site. He looked up at it. Oh, he said, I thought it'd be bigger. She told me she just walked away after that. These stories never stop. Every city, every country, every tourist season brings new ones. And look, I get it. Geography is hard. The world is big. Not everyone grows up learning where every capital is or how the metric system works. That's fine. But the confidence is what gets me. The absolute certainty that Prague is near Paris, that Dublin is in the UK, that Europe is the size of a shopping mall. It's that mix of confusion and confidence that creates these moments. And honestly, I don't share these to mock anyone. I share them because they're funny, because they remind us how different our perspectives can be, because they show how easy it is to get things mixed up when you're somewhere new, and because, deep down, we've all been that lost tourist at some point. Maybe not thinking the Eiffel Tower is in Prague, but close enough. So next time you travel, double-check your map, Google the capital, learn the basics, or don't. Either way, you'll probably end up in someone's story. And that's okay. The world needs more funny stories. Just maybe pack a better map. And trust me, these stories